My whole life I've loved video games in some form or another, and that's why it's really important to me to always have access to those video games that were a part of my childhood or my upbringing, or that I played during a certain important time period of my life. And I like having access to these retro consoles, which is why you're looking at my retro gaming setup. And this contains all my consoles from the 80s, 90s, even a little bit of the early 2000s. And I've got them all hooked up to a CRT television the way they were meant to be seen. I've got about a little over 20 different machines back there that play games, though I don't need to have them all hooked up at the same time due to some redundancy and backwards compatibility and stuff. But I wanted to get my setup to the point where I could actually just decide that I want to play a game, walk to my retro setup, turn it on, and pretty much everything just works. If you've ever tried to build your own retro setup, you'll know that the big thing you're going to run into is cable management and getting all those sources switched and choosing, which console you want to play at any given time. And then once you've got that all figured out, whether you've got a bunch of, daisy-chained switch boxes connected, or however you've managed to get 10 or 12 consoles hooked up, then you've got to explain it to somebody else who wants to play how to do it. Oh, switch it to input 1 and then hit number 3 on this selector box and do a dance and spin, and it just gets too crazy. So I wanted to make it so that myself or my wife or my stepdaughter or anybody who wants to come in here and play one of these old things could actually just walk in, basically turn it on, and it'll just work. I've decided that I need to hook up about 10 machines to play everything that I want to play at any given time, and getting 10 sources for these old machines into one old TV is really difficult. Part of the problem is that they use different kinds of outputs. For example, some of them I've got connected using component cables, which are these, sort of red, green, and blue RCA connections, which is what I prefer to hook up my old consoles with if that option exists. And then a lot of them are connected using the old standard composite. That would be this yellow video cable, and then the audio is on the red and white. Either way, you've got to have those red and white cables for audio. And so I've got like a smattering of different kinds of connections back there, and getting one device to handle all those, especially one that's, made in the modern era so that I know it's not going to fail, has proven to be quite difficult. So what have I been doing up to this point? Well, I've tried a lot of different things. I used to try to connect everything all up at once and just kind of connect them to different inputs. I think there's 2 different composite inputs on that TV and 1 component input, and then there's one on the side of the TV. And so you can connect different things and then have a switch box in between, so you could switch it to video 1, output 3. But then that just gets super complicated. If somebody's like, I want to play the Nintendo 64, I have to do a math equation to figure out which console and which button combination to push. What I eventually started doing, especially because cable management was really becoming a problem with trying to set all that up, is I actually took all of the cables off of the consoles and wrapped them up and put them in nice little neat Ziploc bags and kept them in that little basket down there, that drawer. And then that way, whenever I wanted to play something, I could just hook it up on the spot. I found that to be a lot easier than just trying to manage all those cables and have that kind of convoluted setup. But I found that if the console's not hooked up, I'm just less likely to play it. If I know I can walk over and turn it on, especially if it's something that I just want to play, just a quick 20 minutes of an old NES game or something, I'm not going to bother taking the time to figure out how to route the power and then plug that in and go through that whole mess. I wanted to eliminate that and just make it so that I can enjoy these games whenever I want. Why a CRT? Because I know some of you are probably screaming why won't you just try to hook this up to a modern TV? You can get a FrameMeister or something like that and get it looking really good on a modern TV. There's a lot of options these days for playing on a modern display, not the least of which are these little mini consoles that have been coming out, like the Super Nintendo Classic. Of course, there's the NES Classic, there's a PlayStation 1, there's a Sega 1 announced. And these are great, and I do like them, and I use them, obviously. But, for one thing, they're limited. I mean, unless you want to mod them or whatever, they only come with 20 or 30 games. and I want to be able to put my cartridges in from childhood or that I've bought and added to my collection and actually play the real thing. I like using original controllers, which is not always an option using emulators or some other, modern approach to doing this. Specifically for me, it really has a lot to do with the CRT, especially if we're talking about like 8 and 16-bit era games where that was the only option, was this kind of basic square CRT television. And they were designed with the limitations of CRT in mind, and the developers knew that these games would look a certain way when it came to the end product. It just makes me happy to know that I'm sort of seeing the games as they were originally intended. Now, the emulator scene is great for being able to play these old games, or maybe, play stuff I don't have access to and not have to worry about old failing hardware and stuff like that. But there is a difference between seeing those sharp pixels that are, picture perfect on a screen versus seeing it on, one of these old CRTs with scan lines and bloom, and it's just something that I really appreciate. I like turning it on and hearing the CRT noise and feeling it get warm and hearing it crackle and just that whole experience of it. And, when I share this with other people who may not be so familiar with the retro gaming stuff, such as my stepdaughter, I kind of like the idea that all of that is part of the experience and that they can kind of see how I used to play games versus how they're played now. Like I said, this is pretty much all my consoles from around the year 2000, 2001, and before. I don't need them all hooked up because of some backwards compatibility and stuff, so we're going to take a quick look at that and see exactly how I plan on routing all those cables and stuff. I'm using IKEA Kallax furniture, those shelves back there, which is pretty common for stuff like this, common in the retro gaming scene. It's the same shelves I use over at my DJ booth to hold my records, but there's no backing to them, and so cable management becomes a real issue. So starting up top, we have my Commodore 64 setup. Of course, I only need one of these hooked up. I just have both because I'm a hoarder of retro hardware. Same with this Commodore 128. It just hangs out up here looking pretty most of the time. Of course, I have a few handhelds, but I really don't have to worry about hooking those up. Actually, the Sega Nomad will connect to your TV and allow you to connect a second controller. Down here we have my PlayStation 2 Slim and a PS3 Slim, which actually doesn't even work. It's just here for display, and I have a fat model PS3 on the other side of the room. I consider it too new for a CRT setup, really. And right here is an original Sony PlayStation, and actually, it's mostly for display too. Remember, the PS2 is backwards compatible, and it'll be connected with a nice crispy analog component cable. Then we have an original Microsoft Xbox, which barely fits on this shelf. And we have 2 Gamecubes and a Wii. Now, since this Wii is backwards compatible with Gamecube software and hardware, and once again can easily be connected with component cables, it's really a better choice for playing my Gamecube games. Not only that, but the Wii can easily be soft-modded and turned into a retro gaming emulation box. Plus, I have a Wii U connected to my HD TV, and it's fully compatible with the Wii software and hardware, so yeah, all that to say, the Gamecubes are just there to look pretty right now. Now along the bottom we have the other Nintendo consoles, N64, Super Nintendo, NES, and up here we have the Sega consoles, my original pre-order model Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, and Sega Genesis Model 2 with the ill-fated 32X add-on. I really need to add a Sega CD to this setup. And over here I have an Atari 2600. It's mostly here to honor Atari's legacy, but honestly I'm not much of a 2600 fan. I don't keep it hooked up. Now up here I have just a couple of spares. My wife and I both brought Sony Playstations into this relationship. And this is a Model 1 Genesis, sadly not the more desirable model with the high-definition graphics text around the top, but still cool to show off. And so that gives a general idea of the game library I want access to. That's a lot of things to connect to one TV, which has like 3 inputs. I just want to play any given console without hassle. The problem is I need to be able to handle at least component and composite video. Finding a switch box that does both of those in the modern era and can handle 10, 20 inputs, it just doesn't exist. I did find a really old device that was called the Pelican System Selector Pro. This came out in the early 2000s, and it actually did support composite, component, and S-video, which is a really nice option. I do have some S-video connections back there. They haven't made them for years. They're hard to come across. They pop up on eBay every now and then, but they get snatched up like that. But then I found this. This is the gcompsw. well, it's called this. And this is a really fascinating device because it's actually 8 input, 2 output, and it handles both component and composite video. So you'll see you've got your audio here, your yellow for your standard composite video, and then your component inputs here. And what this will do is it's actually an automatic switching device. So you'll notice there's no buttons on it. Basically, it will sense whatever video signal from whatever console, and then it switches to the proper input automatically. Really pretty fascinating. You just plug a little micro USB, 5-volt power into it, and it's pretty much good to go. And the cool thing about it is, even though it's got 8 inputs, you can use both the composite and the component at the same time, and it will still work. So you effectively can get up to 16 different devices connected with this thing. The only problem with this device is that it is a limited run thing. This is not something that you can just go to Target and buy or order off of Amazon. The person who makes this is the same person who also makes the popular gScartsw, which is a very similar device, but I wanted something that would actually take inputs that you would expect here in a North American market. That's not to say that this is the best, clearest, or most crisp option for displaying these games. Really, if you want to get super hardcore about it, I should be going and converting these consoles to RGB, modding them or getting proper cables for them, and then connecting them via SCART cables and doing a whole thing. But that project for me would have cost hundreds of dollars and possibly been 4 figures, and I'd rather spend that money on games. So as I convert different machines over to component, for example, there are now component cables available for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis and older consoles like that. That is a better connection, and so I can connect it using that. So overall, I can connect up to 16 by mixing and matching. All I've got to do is make sure that I cater to the audio. Okay, I've rambled long enough. I'm going to take a look over here and see what the actual plan is. I'm going to figure out how to hook up all this power. We're going to talk about cable management. I'm going to pull that thing out and start sweeping and things because I'm sure it's a mess back there, and see if we can turn this into a nice, pretty retro gaming setup that's ready to go at a moment's notice. Alright, so first things first, the teardown process. Now luckily most of these aren't hooked up right now, so removing the wiring won't be as bad as it could be. Now up here in the right, I have all my loose game cartridges. My CD and DVD based games are stored elsewhere in the room, so I'll have to clear that out as well. I think a future project of mine is going to be collecting and or creating the proper boxes and manuals for these games so that I can properly display those as well. And there we go, I've successfully created a huge mess, but that's okay, it'll all be worth it in the end. There are hints of attempts at cable management from times past, but the more I add and remove and change things, the worse it gets. Inevitably, I end up ripping it all out of here and redoing it, and the cycle continues. No more. I'm over this crap. Now it's time to break down the rest of the furniture so I can give all this stuff a good cleaning. Now, luckily, mine is actually made up of several small pieces of furniture, so it's not too bad of a project to do on my own. And yeah, I was right, it's pretty gross back here. I wasn't about to miss the opportunity to shine everything back up. And a little bit of Swiffer dustering should help get this cleaned up, as well as some general purpose spray cleaner which I've diluted with water. And this will help me get my shelves looking bright white again. So I invested in a bunch of cable management sort of raceways that look like this. They're nice because they come apart. You can slide your cables through there any which way, but they also have those nice little entryways on the side, all up and down. On this IKEA Kallax furniture, they have these kind of thick edges around the outer borders, and it's just about the right size for these raceways. And so I'm thinking that I could basically just do some vertical runs along these thicker parts, run all my cables through there, and then that way the longest run of any cable is only going to be going directly from the console, going straight into that raceway. Now these cable management thingies had convenient adhesive backing, so I'll just stick those on the back of these shelves like so. And yeah, everything lines up pretty much perfectly, and the color's a perfect match. Stealth mode, I like it.
Alright, I've gotten this all cleaned up, and I've gotten these cable raceways installed kind of all around the bottom and then up the side here, so that I can get to the stuff that's going to be up here. You're basically looking at what will be the back side of this setup. You'll see these black cable management raceways here, and here. Those were just pieces that I already had on there. I figured there was no reason to really pry those off. You know, I think it looks pretty good, and the point here is to be invisible more than to be pretty. Start hooking stuff up and see if we can try that gcompsw.
Alright, so the downside of having everything made up of little pieces is that it takes me a while for me to get everything perfectly lined up again. Now, this top right piece was actually left over from a kitchen renovation. It wasn't used, but we couldn't return it, so I used it here. Anyway, I think I'll start with this little tower on the left so that I can work on some of these vertical runs. Now, between my hobby of DJing and my former career as a systems administrator, I have a lot of experience with trying to keep these cables reined in. I love how these little lids keep everything nice and tidy. And yes, that's what I'm talking about. Almost reminds me of a well-organized server rack, and that makes my inner geek so happy. I've started setting up my first couple of component sources there. You can see those hooked up, and they're just kind of hanging here. I realized as I started hooking things up that I'm probably going to need a vertical run of some of this cable management stuff going horizontally across where the TV is, just to get all of this stuff, you know, over to the new switch. Maybe I'll Velcro mount it or find some way to screw that in. And I think it'll be okay kind of exposed here. I think as long as I can keep things really tidy and wrapped up and looking neat, I think that's actually quite a beautiful piece there. Got some of these, they're little Velcro wire wraps so that I can keep things tightened up, along with the raceway here. And that's what it's starting to look like down there. I'm going to put another one of these white things alongside the power strip, and we're just going to make this look super duper organized by the time it's done. One cool thing about this switch, it also supports both component and composite inputs, and so it's not going to like automatically upscale your old composite sources or anything like that. This is literally a switching device. It's just a really versatile one. And so the most you'll ever have to do is maybe hit the input button on the TV, you know, to switch between this kind of video and this kind of video. The only thing about that is you'll notice there's only one set of audio inputs. These red and whites are audio, and so if you're using both component and composite sources, you got to do something with that audio. A whole handful of these guys, and they're really just little Y adapters, and I'm going to put those in each of those red and white, and then you can share those signals, so should not be a big deal.
Okay, here it is. Everything is hooked back up, or at least everything that I need hooked back up in order to play my entire game library. I've got everything run to the switch over here, which I still need to find a way to mount, but for now it's just kind of hanging out right there. And as you can see, everything looks actually pretty good. I've gotten all of the cables either hidden or very well organized and bundled. I make good use of those wire wraps, and there's easy access to all of the power now, which is really great. So the theory is that I should be able to turn on this TV and have stuff just work. The most I should ever have to do is hit the input button on my remote, or the source button. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. I'm just going to pick a random console, and let's go with the Genesis. It's got the 32X hooked up with it. This is a really unique game called Tempo. Interesting side-scrolling platformer. Alright. Oh, alright. So it automatically senses whichever input. And we're good. It works.
You know what time it is. Yo, homie, listen in. Careful, check it out. You know he makes it funky, and it's good to go. Oh, man. Catch the moon in New York, LA, everywhere we can go. The house tonight. You know it's gonna move your mind. The groove is
Awesome. So let's try out the PS2. Of course, I'll have to switch to component on my TV. Beautiful. We're in business. Now, of course, these things should be able to work in conjunction with each other, so if I turn on my Genesis and I switch over to the composite output, interesting enough, it leaves me with a black screen, so let's see what happens when we turn off the component source. It pops right up. Sound work? Awesome. So that's great. So now I've got, well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 video game machines hooked up right now, and I've got some room to grow. Like I said, by mixing those inputs and outputs, I've still got room to sort of add into that switch, and everything will just happen automatically, just like it does now. I can turn something on, and it changes inputs. I don't have to think about it. That's just awesome. In fact, realistically, I should be able to turn on any of these systems, and it automatically switches right over to the Saturn without me even trying. Really happy with the gcompsw. I'm going to run it through the paces, do some gaming on this setup, get used to any of the quirks that it might have, and if anybody's interested, I'll come back with a full review. But for now, I'm stoked to play some old games.
And play some old games I shall. My buddy Ryan and my brother Steven both came over and helped me test the setup, and we had lots of fun playing one of my all-time favorites, Sonic 2. It accomplished everything I'd hoped, to be able to just play when I wanted to play.
It's like, you can tell that I know how to play this, but you can also tell that it's been a very long time.
Sonic 1 is like way different than Sonic 2 or 3, man.
Yeah, no spin dash.
Yeah, no spin dash.
You wore the shirt and everything.
I did.
So after I got done with all of this, I decided to add a few more touches to my setup. I wanted to fill out all that empty space on the wall to the top left, so I installed some floating shelves to properly display my handhelds and mini consoles and such. And here's what it basically looks like now. I still want to do a few more things to add some flair. Namely, I'm going to add some colored backlighting to the whole thing so that it matches the theme in the rest of the room. As you can see, my DJ booth area can get quite colorful, so I want to make this area match. And by the way, if you'd like to see the video from which this footage comes from, visit my other YouTube channel, Passionate DJ, or check the description below for a direct link. I think I'll also get a couple of figurines or something to put on the shelves to help everything look a little more fun and less clinical, but other than that, I'm really happy with the way everything's turning out in my little corner of paradise. So that should just about wrap it up for this video. I'll be sure to come back with updates as I make additions or changes to the setup, so be sure to hit that subscribe button and follow me for more stuff like this to come, as well as other things that relate to my music or general geek stuff or whatever else I feel like making. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.